My role as a father. I'm a new father, and I take my duties and my responsibilities to my family very seriously.
Everyone wants some hope and wants some optimism, and I think the Earthshot encompasses urgent optimism.
Planet's health, long before it was an everyday issue. Or the Prince's trust.
Under the glittering lights of the royal family's most sacred vaults, a betrayal of unimaginable scale was unfolding. Priceless heirlooms, symbols of power and tradition, were vanishing without a trace. When the truth finally emerged, it wasn't just a scandal. It was a gut-wrenching revelation. Queen Camilla, trusted by all, had secretly orchestrated the theft of the monarchy's most treasured jewels. The very jewels that held centuries of history were being sold in dark corners of the world, and the man who would be king had to face the devastating truth. The person he loved most had destroyed everything they stood for. It all began in the early months of spring, when a few quiet murmurs among palace staff hinted at something troubling. During a routine inventory check, some of the most iconic royal jewels seemed to have disappeared without a trace. At first, it seemed like a minor oversight. A few pieces may have been moved for restoration, or perhaps they were on loan to a museum. After all, the royal collection is vast, filled with thousands of unique items. Surely, one or two missing pieces could be explained away. However, as the weeks passed, more pieces went missing, and explanations grew increasingly thin. The staff at the palace, for all their decorum, could no longer ignore the growing unease. The feeling of something being wrong was hard to shake. A sapphire brooch, worn by Queen Victoria during her coronation anniversary, had vanished. A pearl choker, once gifted to Princess Diana by a prominent Middle Eastern ruler, was nowhere to be found. Even the ornate diamond-encrusted snuff box, a relic from the Georgian era, had disappeared. Each of these pieces had been logged in last year's inventory, but now their locations were noted only with vague notations. The royal vaults had always been tightly secured, guarded not just by alarms, but by a trusted code of loyalty. For anyone to suggest that the jewels might have been stolen from within the royal household felt unthinkable. Still, the absence of these priceless artifacts could not be ignored. Rumors began to circulate in hushed tones in the grand salons of Kensington and Buckingham palaces, where portraits of long-dead monarchs silently kept watch. Those who whispered about the missing jewels had no concrete proof, but the unease was palpable. As the weeks turned into months, the palace atmosphere began to change, growing tense and more uncertain. Staff members began lowering their voices when certain names were mentioned, and rumors of irregularities continued to swirl. It wasn't long before whispers of these missing jewels reached the ears of a few well-placed figures outside the royal circle. At a private charity event in London, an art dealer from Geneva made a casual comment over champagne. He had mentioned, almost jokingly, that a remarkably rare royal-style tiara had been sold in a private auction in Monaco. It was said to resemble one believed to still be in the Queen Mother's collection. The dealer dismissed it as a convincing imitation, but the comment stuck with those who overheard it. The implication was too bold to ignore. Could it be that a royal heirloom had actually been sold off? Inside Kensington Palace, aides to Prince William, the future king, began quietly cross-referencing the palace's records. They compared old photographs to the current holdings, scrutinizing every detail. The deeper they looked, the more troubling discrepancies emerged. The pieces that had been worn at state banquets or special royal occasions had not been seen in public for years. Official explanations seemed to offer less and less in the way of clarity, and the rumors only grew louder. But still, no one dared to bring such an accusation directly to Prince William. No one wanted to create a scandal without concrete proof. The story was one of whispers, lingering in the shadows, waiting to be addressed but avoided at the same time. Yet the absence of certain heirlooms could no longer be ignored. Despite the palace's best efforts to keep everything quiet, the truth was beginning to seep through the cracks. Someone was taking the jewels. But who? And why? The atmosphere in the royal household grew even more charged as the investigation unfolded, each new piece of missing jewelry adding another layer to the mystery. It was at this critical juncture that Prince William made a pivotal decision. He understood that the matter could not be handled internally without causing greater damage. The royal family's reputation was on the line. The jewels were not just valuable, they were a living history, representing the very essence of the monarchy's legacy. The decision was made to bring in someone who could investigate the issue discreetly, with the expertise to uncover the truth without further damaging the royal image. That person was Simon Harcourt, a former intelligence officer who had since transitioned into private security consulting. Harcourt had previously handled sensitive assignments for the royal family, always operating with quiet efficiency. He was the ideal choice for such a delicate matter, his skills at maintaining confidentiality well known within the palace. His role would be to investigate the missing jewels, to uncover how and why they had vanished, and to find the culprit who had dared to betray the monarchy's trust. Harcourt's investigation was thorough, methodical, and quiet. His task was not just to find the missing jewels, but to discover how they had been taken, who was responsible, and, most importantly, how far the breach in security went. Weeks passed with little to show for his efforts. The investigation was slow, deliberate, and meticulous. He worked from a small office in London, quietly sifting through auction records, sale listings, and photographs, tracing any hint of the jewels' disappearance. And then, one evening, after days of painstaking work, Harcourt found something that seemed too significant to ignore. A diamond necklace that had been worn by Queen Elizabeth II at a state banquet in the 1970s had appeared in a discreet Parisian auction. The seller's name had been obscured by a corporate front, but the necklace's characteristics were unmistakable. The clasp was custom-made to fit the Queen's neck, and the arrangement of diamonds matched archival photographs perfectly. It was clear that the necklace was a genuine royal piece, and its presence in an auction raised far more questions than it answered. This discovery set the investigation into high gear. The more Harcourt dug, the more connections he found. The jewels weren't just disappearing randomly. They were being sold, moved with intention, and traded discreetly on the black market. As Harcourt began to map out the connections between auction houses, private collectors, and intermediaries, he realized that whoever was behind this operation understood the value of the pieces, the importance of their origin, and how to hide their traces. The scandal was no longer just a matter of missing jewels. It was now a full-blown investigation into a highly coordinated theft. For Prince William, the stakes had never been higher. He knew that the matter could not be brushed aside. The jewels had been part of the monarchy's story for centuries. They were more than mere valuables. They were part of the royal family's identity, symbols of power and legacy. Losing them, especially through theft from within the household, would be a blow to the monarchy's integrity that could not be easily repaired. And so, with the evidence slowly mounting, the decision to investigate further was made. As the investigation into the missing royal jewels deepened, the weight of the task became evident. Prince William knew that his family's legacy was on the line, and he needed someone who could uncover the truth without attracting public attention. The pressure to handle the matter discreetly was immense. The monarchy thrived on its image of unity and stability, and any scandal could risk damaging that carefully cultivated reputation. It was a delicate balance. Pursue the investigation too aggressively, and the palace could face irreparable damage. Move too slowly, and the jewels might be lost forever. This was the moment when Simon Harcourt, a former intelligence officer turned private security consultant, was called in. Harcourt's background made him an ideal candidate for such a sensitive task. He had worked on numerous high-profile assignments for the royal family in the past, always with an emphasis on discretion and efficiency. His name was not one to be found in the tabloids, and his presence in the media was almost non-existent. This was precisely what Prince William needed, a quiet, methodical investigator who could go about his work without raising suspicion. The first step in Harcourt's investigation was to gather as much information as possible. He started by reviewing the records of the royal vaults, paying close attention to any missing pieces that had been noted in the previous years. The more he dug, the more troubling the situation seemed. The missing jewels weren't just small, insignificant pieces. They were some of the most valuable and historically important items in the royal collection. The tiaras, brooches, necklaces, and other heirlooms weren't just worth millions of pounds. They carried a deep cultural significance. These were the jewels that had been worn during state dinners, coronations, and high-profile events. They weren't just ornaments. They were symbols of the monarchy's power, history, and continuity. Losing them was unthinkable. Harcourt also began cross-referencing the palace's records with those of reputable auction houses. He knew that if the jewels were being sold, they would likely have appeared in some private or discreet auction. The trick was to trace them without raising suspicion. Auction houses often dealt with rare and high-value items. And while they were well established, they were also occasionally used by those with less than noble intentions. The challenge was to find the right auction house and the right buyer, all while maintaining the utmost discretion. Weeks passed with little to show for Harcourt's efforts. The investigation was slow and meticulous, with small leads popping up here and there, but nothing substantial. The missing jewels didn't seem to follow a clear pattern. Some were very old, dating back to the Georgian era, while others were more modern, like those worn by Princess Diana. Some pieces had been worn by Queen Elizabeth II herself, while others had belonged to past generations of the royal family. Harcourt knew that the jewels had been taken with great care. Whoever was behind the theft knew what they were doing. They were taking items that had deep historical value, not just monetary worth. Then, late one evening, Harcourt made a breakthrough. While reviewing auction records from a luxury auction house in Paris, he stumbled across a listing for a diamond necklace that looked strikingly similar to one worn by Queen Elizabeth II during a state banquet in the early 1970s. The auction house had listed it as a high-quality piece from a European royal family, but the description was vague. There was no mention of its true origins, and the seller's name was hidden behind a corporate front. However, Harcourt could tell from the photos that this was no ordinary necklace. The clasp, the arrangement of diamonds, and the overall design were unmistakable. It was a piece that had been worn by the Queen herself, and now it was being sold, hidden behind a veil of secrecy. The discovery of the diamond necklace set off a chain reaction. Harcourt immediately began digging deeper into the auction records, looking for other potential leads. It didn't take long before he found another clue. A sapphire ring, once owned by Queen Victoria, had appeared in an auction in Geneva. Like the necklace, the ring had been listed under vague descriptions, with no mention of its royal provenance. The pattern was starting to emerge. High-value royal jewels were being sold off in private auctions across Europe, and they were being moved with great care to avoid detection. Harcourt knew that he had to follow this trail wherever it led, even if it took him into the darkest corners of the royal network. The next step was to find out who was behind these auctions. It wasn't enough to trace the jewels themselves. He needed to know who was facilitating the sales. It was clear that the person responsible had both the means and the knowledge to move these jewels without attracting attention. The more Harcourt investigated, the more he realized that this was not a case of simple theft. Someone was orchestrating a larger operation, moving the jewels in and out of the royal vaults without anyone noticing. The investigation took Harcourt to several cities across Europe, from Geneva to Antwerp to Monaco. In each city, he followed the trail of the missing jewels, carefully piecing together the evidence. He discovered that several pieces had been sold through well-established luxury brokers with ties to the European elite. These brokers knew how to handle high-value items like royal jewelry without raising suspicion. Payments for the jewels were routed through offshore accounts, and couriers were hired to transport the pieces discreetly. With each new lead, Harcourt grew more confident that he was on the right track. But there was still one key piece missing. Who was behind this operation? Who had the access to move these priceless artifacts? And more importantly, who had the authority to remove them from the royal vaults without raising suspicion? It wasn't until Harcourt found a link between the missing jewels and a former royal aide that the investigation took a dramatic turn. The aide in question, Charles Everley, had once been a senior figure in the royal household. he had been responsible for coordinating the movement of royal items for exhibitions, state events, and diplomatic purposes. Everly was well connected in the luxury market, and his departure from the palace had been under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Officially, he had retired for personal reasons, but rumors had always suggested that his relationship with certain senior figures in the palace had soured. Harcourt's suspicions grew as he uncovered more about Everly's post-palace career. After leaving the royal household, Everly had set up a consultancy business that specialized in sourcing rare and valuable items for private collectors. His name began to surface in connection with several of the questionable auctions Harcourt had identified earlier. Everly was never listed as a direct seller of the jewels, but his connections were clear. He had facilitated the movement of royal artifacts from the palace to private collectors. Using his extensive network in the luxury market, Harcourt decided to approach Everly directly. He arranged a meeting under the guise of seeking advice for a wealthy client looking to acquire a historically significant tiara. The meeting took place in a quiet corner of an exclusive London club, the kind of place where conversations were never repeated outside its walls. Everly was as polished and composed as ever. He spoke with ease about rare acquisitions and discreet negotiations. But when Harcourt casually mentioned a sapphire ring similar to one in the Queen Mother's collection, Everly's demeanor shifted. For a moment, his smile faltered, and his eyes narrowed. He responded with a vague remark about how many pieces changed hands quietly, without attracting attention, before quickly steering the conversation back to neutral topics. Harcourt knew that this brief shift in Everly's composure was telling. There was more to this story than Everly was letting on. It was clear that Everly knew far more than he had admitted. Harcourt decided to dig deeper into Everly's background. A background check revealed frequent trips to Geneva and Monaco over the past 18 months, coinciding with the dates of the suspicious auctions. What was even more troubling was the discovery that Everly had traveled on multiple occasions with a woman listed under diplomatic clearance. Her identity was concealed from public records, and Harcourt suspected that she played a role in the operation as well. The investigation was now gaining momentum, and Harcourt was getting closer to uncovering the truth. But the question remained: who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? With each passing day, the web of connections grew more complex, and the stakes grew higher. The search for the missing jewels was no longer just about finding stolen property. It was now about uncovering a conspiracy that reached deep into the heart of the royal family. The deeper Harcourt went, the clearer it became that the investigation was leading him toward a person no one had expected. As Simon Harcourt delved deeper into the web of royal intrigue, the investigation was beginning to shift from a matter of stolen jewels to something far more serious, something that could shake the monarchy to its very core. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that this was not just an isolated case of theft, but a carefully orchestrated operation that had been going on for months, if not years. The trail had already led him to Charles Everly, the former royal aide who had once been trusted with the movement of royal items for exhibitions and state events. Everly's post-palace career had been carefully scrutinized, and his ties to the luxury market and private collectors were becoming more evident. But it wasn't just Everly's connections that were troubling. Harcourt's investigation had begun to reveal patterns that pointed to a larger, more calculated scheme. The missing jewels weren't disappearing at random. They were being sold with intent, moved with meticulous planning, and sold in highly discreet auctions. What troubled Harcourt even more was the level of coordination involved. The jewels weren't just being stolen, they were being moved through trusted channels, where high-value gems could change hands without raising suspicion. Harcourt's next step was to focus on Everly. The former royal aide had been at the center of the operation, facilitating the sale of the stolen jewels. His expertise in sourcing rare and valuable items for private collectors made him an ideal player in this scheme. However, it wasn't just his connections that made Everly such a key figure. It was his access to the royal vaults. Everly had once been entrusted with the delicate task of moving jewels for exhibitions, but now, it seemed, he was using that knowledge for far less noble purposes. Harcourt had already found evidence that Everly had facilitated the sale of royal jewels through well-known luxury brokers and auction houses. Payments for these sales had been routed through offshore accounts, and couriers were used to discreetly transport the items. But there was still something missing. The person who had been behind the operation. The one pulling the strings. The one who had been using Everly to move the jewels. At first, Harcourt had assumed that the operation was being run by a small group of individuals working in the shadows. But as he dug deeper, the pieces began to fall into place. It became clear that the person responsible for the thefts, the one who had the access and authority to remove the jewels from the royal vaults without raising suspicion, was someone who held a very high position within the royal family itself. The trail eventually led Harcourt to Queen Camilla, Prince William's stepmother, and the woman who had been at the heart of the royal family's inner circle for years. Harcourt's investigation had uncovered a troubling pattern. Queen Camilla had traveled frequently to European cities such as Geneva, Monaco, and Paris, coinciding with the dates of several suspicious auctions where royal jewels had been sold. More troubling still was the discovery that she had traveled with Charles Everly on several occasions. Each time, their movements were cloaked in secrecy, and their trips seemed to coincide with key sales of royal pieces. Harcourt's suspicions grew stronger as he pieced together the timeline of events. It became clear that Queen Camilla had the authority to access the royal vaults without question. She was one of the few people who had the right to remove jewels for restoration, exhibition, or other official purposes. But these trips to Europe were not for any legitimate purpose. They were, it seemed, part of a far more sinister operation. The evidence began to point to Camilla as the mastermind behind the thefts, or at the very least, as the one who had allowed them to happen. The more Harcourt uncovered, the more disturbing the picture became. He had already discovered that several of the missing jewels had been sold at private auctions, with the transactions being carefully concealed. But now, the investigation was pointing toward Queen Camilla as the person who had been orchestrating the entire operation. It was becoming increasingly clear that she had used her position within the royal family to move the jewels out of the palace without anyone suspecting her involvement. Harcourt knew that this was the moment the investigation would take a dangerous turn. Accusing a member of the royal family, especially someone as prominent as Queen Camilla, was not a step to be taken lightly. There were serious implications for the monarchy, and any move he made could have far-reaching consequences. But the evidence was undeniable. It wasn't just a few missing jewels. It was a coordinated effort to sell off some of the most historically significant pieces in the royal collection. It was at this point that Harcourt decided to confront Prince William with his findings. He knew that the time had come to bring the matter to light, even if it meant facing the potential fallout of implicating a member of the royal family. Harcourt's findings had led him to a devastating conclusion. Queen Camilla, with her authority and access to the royal vaults, had been using her position to move the jewels and sell them to private collectors. The weight of this discovery was not lost on Harcourt. He understood the gravity of the situation. Prince William had always been a man who valued the monarchy's integrity above all else. He had been raised to understand the importance of safeguarding the crown's legacy. This scandal, if it were to be made public, would shake the very foundation of the royal family. It would be a blow to the monarchy's reputation, and it could spark a public outcry that the palace would struggle to contain. When Harcourt presented the evidence to Prince William, it was clear that the future king was shaken. The discovery that his stepmother, Queen Camilla, could be involved in such a scheme was a blow that no one could have anticipated. William had trusted her as part of his family, and the idea that she could betray the royal family in this way was almost impossible to comprehend. The jewels, after all, were more than just valuable possessions. They were symbols of the monarchy's history, each piece telling the story of the British royal family. To see them sold off to private collectors, hidden away from public view, was a betrayal of everything the monarchy stood for. William listened in silence as Harcourt laid out the evidence, detailing the travel records, the auction listings, and the testimonies from those who had handled the jewels. With each new piece of information, the weight of the situation grew heavier. The photographs of the jewels, the records of their sales, and the connections between Camilla and Everly all pointed to the same conclusion. Queen Camilla had used her position within the royal family to move these priceless artifacts without anyone suspecting her. And the question now was, what would be done about it? Prince William knew that he could not ignore the evidence. The monarchy's credibility was at stake, and any decision he made would have far-reaching consequences. To publicly accuse a member of the royal family of such a serious crime would ignite a scandal the likes of which the palace had not seen in generations. But to do nothing would be to allow the jewels and the monarchy's integrity to be compromised. In the days that followed, William spent hours poring over the evidence, weighing his options. He knew that whatever decision he made would be a turning point for the royal family. The legacy of the monarchy, its reputation, and its very survival depended on the choice he made. The confrontation with Camilla, if it were to happen, would be a moment of reckoning not just for her, but for the entire royal family. William's mind raced with conflicting emotions. He had always believed in the monarchy's values of duty, honor, and responsibility, but now those values were being tested in ways he had never imagined. Camilla had been a trusted member of his family, and to confront her with such a serious accusation was not something he took lightly. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The jewels were gone, and Camilla seemed to be at the heart of it all. As Prince William prepared for the inevitable confrontation, he knew that the monarchy's future rested on his shoulders. The decision he made would define his reign, and the consequences of that decision would echo for years to come. The stage was set for a dramatic turn of events, one that would change the royal family and the monarchy forever. The days following Simon Harcourt's presentation of the evidence were filled with a sense of quiet tension. Prince William knew that the matter was now out of his hands. The investigation had led to a startling and undeniable conclusion. Queen Camilla, his stepmother, had used her access to the royal vaults to move priceless royal jewels out of the palace and sell them to private collectors. The discovery had shaken him to his core, and now the question was what to do with this information. His duty was to protect the monarchy and to preserve the legacy of the crown. But what could be done when the threat came from within? Camilla's position in the royal family had always been one of respect and trust. Yet the evidence Harcourt had gathered could not be ignored. The monarchy was built on a foundation of trust and duty. For generations, the royal family had upheld a code of conduct that demanded loyalty and integrity from those within its ranks. But this was a betrayal of the highest order. The jewels, after all, were not just valuable treasures. They were symbols of the royal family's power, history, and authority. They had been worn by monarchs during important ceremonies, state visits, and other significant events. To see them stolen and sold in secret to private collectors was an assault on the monarchy's very identity. Prince William spent the next few days grappling with the enormity of the situation. Confronting his stepmother, the queen consort, would not be easy. He had always respected her role within the royal family, and their relationship had been cordial, even friendly at times. But now, everything has changed. The trust that had once existed between them was shattered. Camilla had taken something that was not just the monarchy's to guard, but the people's as well. The jewels were not just heirlooms, they were living symbols of continuity, a tangible connection between past monarchs and future generations. For William, the decision to confront Camilla was not something that could be rushed. It would have to be handled delicately, with care and precision. The stakes were too high to risk a hasty decision. There was no room for error. A confrontation would change everything, but the alternative, doing nothing, was equally unacceptable. The monarchy could not afford to let such a breach of trust go unpunished, no matter who was involved. The morning of the confrontation arrived with a chill in the air. It was a gray, overcast day in London, and the royal household was unusually quiet. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, as though the entire palace was holding its breath. Camilla had been informed of the meeting hours before, and she was expected to arrive shortly. William had chosen a private, less formal setting for their discussion. The blue drawing room at Buckingham Palace was an ideal location. The room was peaceful, away from the prying eyes of the public, and it offered a sense of privacy that William needed. As the door opened, Camilla entered the room with her usual poise and grace. She was dressed impeccably, a picture of royal composure, but there was something in her eyes that betrayed her calm demeanor. William could tell that she knew something was wrong. She had always been perceptive, and though she had not been told the purpose of the meeting, she likely sensed that it was no ordinary conversation. William stood as she entered, his expression neutral, though inside, his heart was heavy. This was not a conversation he had ever expected to have, but it was one that could not be avoided. Camilla took her seat across from him, folding her hands neatly in her lap, and for a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other. "What is this about?" Camilla asked, her tone even, but there was a sharpness to it that William hadn't heard before. He knew she was trying to remain calm, to maintain control of the situation, but there was a subtle tension in the way she held herself. William remained composed as he slid the dossier across the table toward her. He gestured for her to take a look. "I think you should go through this before we speak further," he said quietly. Camilla hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking from the dossier to William, but eventually she picked it up and began flipping through the pages. The room was silent, except for the sound of the paper rustling as she scanned the contents. William watched her closely, his gaze never leaving her face. He could see the subtle shift in her expression as she read. It was almost imperceptible, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it disbelief? Guilt? He couldn't tell, but it was clear that she was reading the same damning evidence that Hardcourt had compiled. When she finished reading, Camilla placed the dossier down on the table and looked at William. Her expression was still composed, but there was a hard edge to her gaze now. "This is absurd," she said, her voice cold. "You know how these things are handled. I have been involved in royal matters for years, and you're telling me that I've stolen something, that I've betrayed this family?" William's heart ached as he listened to her, but he couldn't back down. "The evidence is clear, Camilla," he said. "These jewels were moved without authorization. The records show that they were sold in private auctions, and the money was routed through offshore accounts. I want to know why. Why would you do this? What reason could you have for betraying us in this way?" Camilla's composure faltered for the briefest moment, but she quickly recovered. She leaned back in her chair, her hands resting in her lap. "There are always reasons for what we do, William," she replied, her voice lower now. "But what you're suggesting is simply not true. These jewels have been moved before, for restoration, for exhibitions. It's part of the royal family's work. It's not as simple as you're making it out to be." William wasn't convinced. "I don't believe that, Camilla. Not anymore. There's too much evidence. And I don't think you're telling me the truth. You've been traveling to Europe, to places where these jewels have been sold. You've been seen with Charles Everley, a man who has been tied to the sale of these pieces. You were the one who had access to the vaults, who had the authority to move them. I need you to tell me why." For a moment, there was a tense silence. Camilla didn't answer immediately, and William could see that she was grappling with the truth of what he was saying. Her expression hardened, but the vulnerability he had sensed earlier flickered again in her eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "I did what I had to do," she said. "I never meant for it to go this far. I was trying to protect us, protect the monarchy, but I never imagined it would come to this." William's chest tightened at her words. "Protect us? Protect the monarchy?" "You've torn it apart, Camilla," he said, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't about protecting the crown. This is about greed. You've put your own interests above the very institution you swore to serve." Camilla's eyes darkened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stood up, smoothing her dress as she did so. "I've done what I've done," she said, her voice colder now. "You have your evidence. Do what you must. But don't pretend this was some kind of simple betrayal. This was far more complicated than you realize. With those words, she turned and left the room, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. William remained seated, staring at the closed door, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The confrontation had not gone as he had hoped. Camilla had not admitted to her actions, but she had not fully denied them either. The evidence was there, undeniable, but the personal connection, the bond between them, made the entire situation more painful than William could have imagined. The next steps would not be easy. The monarchy had to make a decision that would resonate far beyond the palace walls. Queen Camilla's title, her public role, and her place in the royal family were now in question. But for William, the monarchy's integrity had to come first. The jewels, symbols of the royal legacy, had been stolen, and the truth could not be ignored. It was time to make a decision that would change everything. The ramifications of this moment would echo for years to come, but the course of action was clear. The crown's legacy was non-negotiable, and no one, no matter their position, could be above the law. The monarchy's future depended on protecting its heritage, even if it meant making the hardest decision of all. The press would soon learn the truth. The palace would be rocked by the storm that was about to break. But for William, there was no turning back now. The time for silence had passed. The crown would be protected, no matter the cost.